Ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. It's a real pleasure for me to introduce Christopher Flynn. Christopher Flynn is a U.S. teaching professor at the Department of University MOU. And after getting a degree in social science, he's also got a PhD at the Chicago University. So he combines two sets of skills. He published widely, and he's also very familiar with our country. He has been often to our country. He spent times teaching, and he also married an Italian economist, Daniela Del Boca, who's an excellent economist, and she also deals with topics closely related to his. He has dealt with Italy extensively, analyzing the infrastructures of the Italian system and comparing them to the American system. He is also actively involved in the Child Center for Household Labor and Demographic Economics.
Nel campo dell'economia e nel campo della popolazione della famiglia.
And he's very good in this field, and I find this combination very interesting. As I said, it was a pleasure for me to greet him here for a good reason. Not just for him being a male economist, having dealt for so many years with women-related topics, and that's a rare occurrence per se. In addition to that, his professional and personal marriage with Daniela Del Boca has been very fruitful. They have also worked together on family-related issues. So in my opinion, but that is to be confirmed by him, also then drawing inspiration and ideas from their day-to-day married life. I'm a working mother myself, so when I was asked to chair this panel, I felt very much called upon, because we all know how difficult it is to combine the two realms, so your working and personal life. So that's why I think that this is a topic that concerns all of us closely enough, and the same thing should be true to our partners, but it's not always that true. But we get there eventually. Before turning the microphone over to Christopher, I wanted to give you some information, some background. Italy combines two negative records. Italy has one of the lowest birth rates in Europe, 1.34%, and at the same time also one of the lowest women employment rate, 45.3%. So we combine these two negative records. In Denmark, women employment rate is 71%, birth rate is 1.8%. The UK employment rate is 65% for women, a fertility rate of 1.8, and France has an employment rate of 58% and almost a 2% birth rate. So Italy has now entered the vicious circle. We have fewer offspring because we have to work in a way, but indeed we work less than our European counterparts. So that's a background I would like to lay for the foundation and for Christopher Flynn's remarks.
Grazie Myrta. Io parlo in inglese, purtroppo, mia lezione. Posso parlare un po' in italiano, ma prima...
Speak Italian for a while, but first of all, I wouldn't want to torture your beautiful language. And then when I talk about economics, I tend to think in English too. And I'd like to be clear in my presentation. There are these very subtle concepts I'd like to outline more clearly. That's why I'll now switch to English.
So the discussion today, it's a I'm going to talk about some empirical results as different from a number of the lectures here when we talk about human capital, social capital. In terms of my own research, I tend not to focus too much on those concepts because they're so hard to measure. I don't think that when you talk about child development, however, you can escape thinking about these things. So part of the talk will be discussing some empirical results. Part of the talk will be criticizing a large number of these empirical results. Part of the talk will be laying out a framework, part of which was initiated by Gary Becker, who starts speaking at 5:30, so I'll try to be brief. And I'll try to provide some framework in which I think we should think about these questions and what the difficulties are in terms of coming up with precise answers about the relationship between working mothers and child outcomes, we'd say in English. So, number of things. First of all, one theme in this is going to be, when you talk about human capital, whenever you're talking about capital, whether it be physical capital or human capital, you're speaking of investment. Investment is a dynamic process. You put out some money today or time today, and you only get the advantages from this, the returns from this, in the future. What else do we know? They're highly uncertain what those returns will be typically. Same is true as investing in financial instruments or investing in children to some extent. So it's a dynamic phenomenon. When we talk about the relationship between mothers working and child outcomes, how do we want to measure at what point in time? Mothers working when the child is 2, the child outcomes when the child is 15. What's the relationship between working at one period of time and child outcomes at some other point in time? So one thing that people may not be used to that was possibly initiated with Gary Becker is talking about quality of children. We'll talk about children like investment goods in some way. So as economists, we don't deny the role of sentiment and so on. We all hopefully love our children and so on. But we talk about trying to improve the quality of our children. We try to improve it for reasons, altruistic reasons. We'd like them to be better in their life, and for selfish reasons. We get more utility, more pleasure when our kids are better, in some sense of the word. What better means is controversial. But in particular, when we're talking about child outcomes, there's so many things that determine child outcomes. How can we isolate the role of the mother working? Right? I mean, it's a difficult point. It's involved with the children, with the friends of our children, with the schools they go to, with so many factors. How can we isolate this one factor of the mother working that typically is not an exogenous event in any event, right? It's determined inside the household. And what do we mean by quality of children? So as economists, we want to try to at least give some concrete sense of what we mean. So this will show you what an early stage we are at in terms of analyzing these kinds of questions, even though as microeconomists, household economists, labor economists, we've been thinking about these issues now for at least 50 years. So measures of quality, typically the things I'm going to relate to you in terms of test results, well, in terms of outcomes that are measurable, are very primitive things. Things like how a child performs on a standardized test. A test that is administered to the child that takes something like 15 minutes to do. So, how they do in school, measured at some point in time. How many years of school do they end completing? In Italia, what kind of schools do they go to? Classico, liceo, scientifico, what? Behavioral outcomes. Do they have problems with drugs, with relating to other people? They smoke, they drink alcohol, sexual activity. Do they become teenage mothers, unwed mothers? And what is their success in the market? So if we measure the outcomes of these children 20 years after their mother possibly worked when they were 3 years old, can we measure any discernible effect 20 years later in terms of these outcomes that we're going to see, labor market and so on? So why should we be concerned? The state invests a lot in education. Unfortunately, of children. They invest a lot more, unfortunately, possibly in pensions and a number of other things. I can only speak for the United States. I won't generate any controversy with respect to Italy, but old people in the United States are certainly treated much better than young people. Nonetheless, here's a little table of some results compiled by Hanushek, I believe it was, fairly recently, maybe 5 years ago. These are expenditures in dollars, as of, let's say, 5 years ago, on primary education and secondary education, so elementare e liceo. You can see that this is all in dollars, so Italy, even though the per capita income in Italy is a fair amount lower than the United States, Italy is spending about as much per student as the United States is, spending significantly more than is the UK, and about the same as Norway, another fairly well-known welfare state where there's lots of state expenditures on medicine, pensions, education, and so on. So in Italy, spend a lot of money on education. We had Alan Kruger yesterday talked about what's the return from the investment. That's a different story. I'm not going to go into that so much. Why is it important to invest in children? Why does society care about both the fertility rate? Why should they care about the fertility rate? And why should they care about the quality of the children being produced? Now here we might speak of quality from the society's point of view in many dimensions. Earning capacity, because when you look at the budget in the end of the day, the government looks at the budget, how much money is being reported that's taxable. That taxable income funds pension payments, funds the health system, funds school instruction. So governments are naturally concerned with both the number, the size of the population, and in Italy we know is strongly decreasing, native-born population, and the quality of the population. They're concerned about both, or they should be. In studying educational outcomes, studying what we call in economics the life cycle, how things generate over time, one thing we'll be led back to over and over again here is how economists in the end say there's so much we can't explain, that's just explained by what we call initial conditions, how people started out, the families they were born into. Other factors that happen to them matter, but these initial conditions matter the most. So it's important to have children especially start at a good point. If they start at a good point, they end at a good point. Therefore, if we create an adult generation that's of high quality, we're likely going to have the next generation of high quality as well. So I argue there's a big multiplier effect. Expenditures now that increase the quality of the population, increase the quality in the future through this multiplier effect. Another theme I'm going to come back to is one of data. We are talking about extremely complicated phenomena, extremely complicated, much more complicated than physics. People often say, oh, these economists are just they're frustrated physicists. What we're trying to understand is much more complicated than what physicists are trying to understand. Because we're trying to understand people who have their own programs, their own objectives, who are constantly changing. It's very complicated. We can't hope to ever understand it without measuring it. Unfortunately, there's only a few societies in the world right now where there's important efforts devoted to data collection. Italy, unfortunately, is not one of them. When I talk about, there's very few, Italy's in a big club, but most of these results I'll talk about pertain to the United States situation or the United Kingdom. While there are some detailed household surveys in Italy that are done that are high quality, the Banco d'Italia household survey, it's a high quality survey, but they're not focused on children or development or child development. Another theme of the talk is going to be, this is such a complicated phenomena. Anyone who knows my work knows I tend to work with complicated models. And there's a lot of controversy about that in the profession. I would say, how can you understand complicated behavior without complicated models? In the end, I'm going to show you a very simple version of one and argue why it's really not that complicated, and it's certainly not complicated compared to the reality that all of you make choices in every day in your household and your work life. And so I'm going to say that the associations that have been found between mothers working when the child's young and certain kinds of outcomes are just associations for the most part. They tell you nothing about, for example, what would happen in Italy. I know this is going to be very frustrating, but it tells you nothing about what's going to happen in Italy if the participation rate of married women goes from 40% to 80%. We just don't know. We can't extrapolate these results to that situation. I'm going to try to say what we might have to know or understand to be able to do that. So I'm going to just very briefly summarize some of these results, which I want you to think of as associations. So these would be results obtained from surveys, sometimes panel data surveys, that's data collected in the same households over time, in which there'd be some measures of what mothers were doing when the child was young, and then some repeated measures. They keep following this household, and they would see what would happen to this child 10 years later, 15 years later, 4 years later, what have you. And you're looking at the relationship, what happened when the child was young, mother working or not working, and then what happened in terms of these child measurements later on. So in general, they try to hold constant a number of factors and then just add in whether the mother worked, father's education, mother's education, and so on. And then just put in, does the mother work or not? Now, what's the association between that, holding all these other things constant, and some child outcome? Well, this strategy is probably most often done using test score data. How did these children, maybe when they're 6 or 7 years old, maybe 4 years after you're measuring whether their mother worked or not, when they were 4 years old, you're trying to see how they scored in some standardized test relative to another similar household in terms of measured characteristics in which the mother didn't work. So in general, in terms of test score results, they tend to find that if the mother worked full-time, that there was some minor negative impact on test scores of the child, let's say 3 or 4 years later. That's if the mother worked. Now, these effects often, as in most social science, tend to wear off over time. So if we go back and measure this kid 10 years later, maybe we don't find much of a difference. If you look at women working part-time instead, you tend to see some weak but positive effects on test scores. So, seems to be full-time work has some cost measured in terms of a test score, in terms of the short run at least. Part-time work doesn't seem to have any cost. If anything, possibly it helps a little bit. How about success in school? So this would be a case in which, once again, we're measuring whether the mother worked when the child was 4 years old or 3 years old. And then now we're looking further down the road. Did the child finish liceo? If we're talking about Italy, unfortunately we don't have the data for Italy. but we're talking about the United States. Did the child finish high school? How many years of school were completed in the end? There's almost no effect. These are longer-term effects, obviously. This is 15 years after the mother was working while the kid was young. Some studies show positive effects. They show positive effects. This is an important point, this study of O'Brien and James, for example. When we talk in social science, when we talk about what's the effect of a mother working full-time versus part-time versus not working on child outcomes, the first question you should ask is, conditional on what? What are the mother's characteristics? What are the father's characteristics? What are the characteristics of the child care system? What are the characteristics of the labor market? Because the answer will depend on all of those things. So what they found was, O'Brien and James is, if you just look at mothers who have a higher education versus those that have, this is for Britain, this study, versus those that have a lower education, the ones that have the higher education, their working had a beneficial effect on the probability that their children attained a higher level of education. Mothers who had a lower level of education, it had no effect or a negative effect. Now, why would that be? That would be because of the kind of work they're doing, what have you, right? The reasons why they're working, whether the mother is serving as a role model, for example, and working in a very professional job, or the mother just has to supplement low household income. So it's frustrating, but as economists, we always have to say it depends. Other effects are on unemployment probabilities. Actually here, tend to find that having a working mother when the child was young decreases the probability of unemployment in the future. This can be because, you know, they just have more labor market skills. They see how their mother worked in the labor market, how she managed her time. They're more likely to be able to find employment, have positive employment skills. Also, there's some findings that children of households in which the mothers worked when they were young had lower levels of psychological stress and so on, bad psychological outcomes down the road. Take all these studies together, all these different kinds of measures of child results, outcomes. What's the effect you find on early the employment of the mother when the child was young? Nothing constant, nothing regular, no regular effects. Does that mean that mother working doesn't have any impact on child quality? Of course it does. Of course it means there still is a very strong likelihood that mother's working has an effect in some way. But in economics, we're used to there being a number of different kinds of effects. I just want to spend 1 minute on a study I think is particularly good that's done in this kind of literature by Haveman and Wolf. These used to be colleagues of mine a long time ago, Tantianifa at Wisconsin. They did a study using, so this is something kind of unique to the United States. There's a panel data study called the Panel Study of Income Dynamics that's been run since 1968. So they followed mothers. They've seen these mothers for 40 years, and they've also followed their children. And they see child outcomes. So these children that were 4 years old, they're now 40 years old. They see how the entire employment history of the mother impacts then what happened to the children when they're adults, young adults. And they found that there were positive, if anything, positive effects on child outcomes of the mother working when they were young. They attributed these effects to the additional income that the mother working provided and the mother serving as a role model in terms of labor market behavior. In the interest of time, I'm going to just skip over these graphs because they're comparative analyses. And I would argue, as Alan Kruger did yesterday, we can't learn anything from this. So I was just going to make a point, we can't learn anything from these because, as I said before, the effect of changing the labor market structure or what have you on outcomes in a society are so dependent on societal institutions. We have such crude measures that we can use to compare across societies that it's rather useless to try to draw any inferences from the cross-cultural, cross-national studies. So what's the economist, what do I view the economist's possible contribution to looking at this to be? Well, it's to supply an analytical framework to think about these questions. That's the first thing. By supplying an analytical framework, we then raise the question of, well, here's the analytical framework. Which data should we have access to be informative about these processes that we view as important in determining child quality? So we went a little bit of theory. So, as I say, I gave a tribute to Gary Becker, who's here. So a lot of the contributions of Gary Becker in particular, and others, but Gary Becker in particular, we're applying concepts, relatively standard concepts, from the theory of the firm, how the comportamento de imprese, how the theory of the firm to the household, viewing the household as really, well, first of all, let's say, you can say, well, what's the firm have to do with the household? Well, a couple of things are comparable, a couple of things aren't. First of all, obviously, at least in my household, we don't maximize profit. I don't know what we maximize, to be honest, but it's not profit. Typically, theory of the firm, that's a nice thing about the firm when you study microeconomics. The firm's complicated strategic behavior, but they just care about money. Obviously, that's not what the household cares about only. So, a number of complicated questions that arise in looking at household behavior. Maybe the most fundamental of which is the household, as we all know, is comprised of a number of different individuals, unless we live alone. And all these individuals have different tastes, different preferences. And we have to find some kind of way to balance all these things to come to some kind of decision, right? That's the complicated thing. Firms behave as one maximize or maximize profits. At least that's the standard story. Households don't. So that's a big difference between households and firms. What are the constraints that households operate under? Well, they operate under income constraints, obviously, and they operate under wage constraints, right? We all know that there's some wage that someone like with us, with our skills or what have you, can command in the market. That acts as a constraint on our decision-making process, in particular our time allocation process. We have limitations, strong limitation in terms of time. We have a time endowment. It's a very binding thing for most of us, more than our income. Then we have environmental constraints, and this is going to be very important. By environmental, I mean everything outside the household, basically, and particularly talking about child development, we mean the schools. We mean even the labor market that our children are going to enter into when they leave the school. The structure of society, number of things, everything that in particular can affect children. Then we have to specify the choices available to the household. What does the household decide? What doesn't it decide? The main point of comparison between the firm and the household are production technologies. These are very important. So firms, we know, we say, yeah, what's a firm? A firm is a production function. It buys a bunch of stuff, it combines it in a way, and it produces something. And we have the advantage in that case that the things it buys are observable, typically, if the firm lets us see it. And the thing it produces is also observable. Households, much more complicated. But the household, we know, is a system of production technologies. There's a production, this is a Gary Becker example, there's a production technology to produce dinner at night, right? Somebody does the spesa, usually the same person, the moya, does the spesa, does the cooking, does whatever, and out comes the dinner. More importantly, that's very important, all these other production processes, but we want to focus on the production process that produces these quality characteristics of children. Okay, so here's a function. Here's a production function. So Q is one of these measures, let's say, of child quality. Something available to us is possibly measurable. X are inputs. Just like a firm decides the raw inputs to buy, to put in the production process, the household decides how many toys to buy, whether to pay for private school for the children, whether to pay for a tutor, whether to pay for a certain kind of babysitter, toys, what have you. S are inputs provided by the environment, the school system, the labor market to some extent, can affect the growth of the child's quality in some way. Most importantly, unfortunately for us, is this variable E, which is a child endowment. Children, as we all are very heterogeneous. They start off with different endowments. They start off at age 0 with different endowments, different capacities. These capacities strongly influence what they're eventually going to become. Maybe more than a lot of these inputs, X and S. How can we measure E? How can we measure E, and in particular recognizing that the choices that parents make in terms of X, they're deciding these investments. The parents know something about E. As economists, we don't know much about E. We infer E, we try to infer E, but this is one of the biggest problems for us of talking about value added. What's the value added of the mothers staying home with the child when the child's 4 years old as opposed to going to the labor market? Well, we don't know exactly, because the mother going to work when the child's 4 years old could have a lot to do with that child endowment E. I could say, my kid's fine, he's learning fine, I don't have any problem, I go out into the labor market now. I have a good babysitter, I have good child care, no problem. Or we could say, no, the child has lots of problems, I feel like I should stay home with the child, so that influences your choice of going to the labor market or not. How can we as economists try to separate the value added of those things when both are strongly driven possibly by that unobservable variable to us, the child endowment? I don't have an answer, but that's the problem. So I've already said what some of the inputs into this process. For the family, those things I said, private child care, for the environmental inputs, public child care, teachers, et cetera, et cetera. This is just a quick thing to illustrate. Yes, households have different sets of preferences. Let M be the mother. So utility of the mother could depend on the mother's own consumption. This is how we think about it as microeconomists. Mother gets a utility. What's her utility depend on? Stuff she likes. Going to the peruquiera, going to this and that, things she likes. Buying dresses. That's C sub M. Q is a child quality. Everybody likes to have good child outcome. Z are other things that the household buys that affect everybody. The house. That's a public good. Everybody benefits from that. Father, U sub F, has different preferences. So when we're looking at household behavior and trying to figure out these answers to these deep questions, we have to think about, well, what are households doing? If we want to be able to figure out what's the value added, what difference does it make whether the mother works when the child's 4 years old or not, we have to first figure out what are households doing. Why would the mother go to work instead of stay home? So what's the household? As a firm, we say maximizes profits. What is the household doing? So the household is maximizing something subject to a number of constraints. That's what economics is. Trade-offs, you're trying to get to some objective. You have all these constraints that limit your choices. What's the best place you can get subject to all the constraints you face? So this is just a much simpler model than you'd have to see. So we'd say here, formally, let's say this is a hotly debated question among economists of the household. Let's say here the households are maximizing the sum of the utilities of the mother and the father. They're going to maximize that subject to choosing what? Well, their choices are constrained. They're constrained by the child quality production function. They can't consume everything themselves, for example. They can't be totally selfish. If they consume everything themselves, that won't leave anything to invest in the child. We'll have a bad child outcome, right? So we're trading off utility I get from buying a new suit versus spending money on the child. We're choosing things like investments in the children, private consumption of the adults and the child, public goods, and most importantly, when it comes to the question we're addressing, the distribution of time. That's another fundamental contribution of Becker. Economics of time. Much more important in some ways than economics of how we distribute our income, how we distribute our time. So in this case, we can think about a mother in particular at least deciding time for her own leisure, time for sleeping, time for working, time for investing in the child, time for playing with the child, time for cooking, time for doing other household production technology. This is what we're faced with every day. This is the complicated problem people are faced with. The family isn't the only one that's making choices that affect the outcome of the children. We already said why it's in the strong interest of the society to get good child outcomes and to have absolutely a fairly large number of citizens as well. So the school can choose investments in the children, and they do. And there's another question of whether these investments are efficient or not. For the same level of money, could we spend it in a different way and get better outcomes? That's a different story. The main point is that the choices in the public sector and the household interact to produce child outcomes. Neither one's indeterminate. You know, you can do so much in the household, but if the child goes to a terrible school, the child's not going to learn anything. If the child goes to a wonderful school and comes home to a terrible household, which the parents fight all day, whatever, there's not going to be a good outcome there either. As Hillary Clinton wrote a book once, it takes a village, it takes everybody working together to produce a good child. So for example, one study is a large-scale program in the United States called Head Start. It's one of the largest public federal government interventions in child development. They spent over $7 billion in 2005, and they enrolled 1 million children in this program. So these are children of usually low-income households, children at risk. Head Start, significant that they're starting behind. They need some help to catch up so that they can do well in school. So it's a preschool intervention to try to get these students ready to compete. What do you find in these social programs typically in the United States or anywhere? You typically find maybe some short-run effects. The question is, do these short-run effects persist over time? There's a lot of debate on this. I'm not an expert in these kinds of programs. There's a lot of debate, but the certainly consensus is that without parent involvement, these programs can't be successful. for the reasons I said. We can take the child's in a terrible household, take them out, expose them to a nice environment for 4 hours a day, send them back to the terrible household for 10 hours. It's not going to work. So they found that, so that's the issue. There's the environment, the Head Start program, there's the household. They're trying to modify the household to reinforce the intervention that they're getting in the actual formal schooling program, the Head Start program. So one thing that they're doing, one interpretation of that is they're trying to change, they're taking people and trying to also, they work with the parents in this case. Parents come in or they go to the household of the students and they actually intervene with the parents as well. So the parents are part of the program. And what they're trying to do, how I would interpret it in terms of our little model, they're trying to change the production technology for child quality. They're trying to teach parents there's a better way to increase child quality that they may not know about because they may come from dysfunctional households themselves. That's the cycle of poverty. I'm better speed up some. So let's talk about the basic trade-off. Basic trade-off of mother working is what? Mother spends more time. We said mothers, and forget about fathers, they're also important components here, but we're concentrating on the mother. I hope at least we are. Mothers are deciding, basically, time to work. Let's just say in our very simple model, time to work, leisure, time to spend with the children, which we think is also having this productive effect. If the mother has a fixed time endowment, if she spends more time in the market, now the time left over is reduced, obviously. But what's the advantage? Well, the advantage now, of course, is the household has more income than it did before if she doesn't work. This income can be spent on a number of things. It can be spent on a new suit or something, but part of it can be spent on the children. So we have these two countervailing effects. The mother in general she's going to reorganize her time. It's not that she's not going to spend any time with her child. Of course she'll spend time with her child. But in general, let's say, she spent a little bit less time with the child than she would if she doesn't work, or much less time. But she can offset that with getting other kinds of substitutes for her reduced time with the child. The question is, what substitutes are available? This is the main question. What substitutes are available to offset this probable loss of time spent with a mother? So the point is how the substitutes that are available. The substitutes, so for example, if there's high quality child care, I can send the child to high quality child care. Maybe it's a little bit less effective in producing child quality, but maybe than personally spending time with the child as a mother, but maybe not much less. And it has some added advantages, right, of socialization, other children, and so on. Now, if there isn't that, if there's only low quality, let's say private child care, which is often the case in the United States at least, available to low-income women who essentially have to work, then that can be a very negative. Then we'd say there's no good substitutes for the mother's time. Unfortunately, the mother is compelled to work because the family is of very low income. They don't eat if she doesn't work. So the investment in child quality is somewhat a secondary consideration. So if you're close to your, nonna or whatever, right? You can substitute. Then that's a good alternative, at least for part of the time. I'll plug my wife's work a little bit. So in Italy, for example, we're going to talk about Italy. In Italy, for example, there does exist a high-quality child care system. Unfortunately, it's not aligned with the labor market in the following sense. This is work my wife's done. I have to plug her work, as we say. You find that you find that, you know, the public child care is open, is high quality in most regions, but is open for a limited amount of time. The time it's open doesn't correspond to full-time work. So you may have the child care may end at 4 o'clock or so, and then your job may end at 6 o'clock. You have to then find some substitute for 2 hours. You have to make some logistic arrangement. The whole question of writing that kind of formal model down is all these constraints that people face. These logistic constraints just complicate everyone's life. There's a very effective child care system in Italy already. It just has to be redesigned a little bit to make it an incredible resource for promoting more entry in the labor market of married women, of mothers. So what's the effect of reduced child time? It's, you know, reduced time with the mother. As I say, difficult to estimate. Difficult to estimate because it's estimating a production function in which, unlike in the case of the firm, we don't measure all the inputs and we don't measure very well the output. We have these crude measures of child quality. Important issue of causality. Which way does it go? As I say, do child outcomes, I gave that example before, do bad child outcomes compel the mother to stay at home? Or does the mother just go to work, doesn't care about what happens to children, and then there's a bad child outcome because she's not there? We don't know. That is, we would have to do a much more careful analysis to distinguish between those two hypotheses. So the point is, in the literature, we have an incredible number of studies that are mainly, almost always, associations. They're just associations. They don't tell us anything about causality, unfortunately. I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies, and then I'll wrap up. A couple of studies that take the approach I favor, which is building a relatively complicated model, but to answer, hopefully, an interesting question. This is a paper by a former colleague of mine, Wilbert van der Klauw, and two co-authors, Liu and Mraz. They did something very interesting. There's a big debate. We heard Alan Kruger talk a little bit about it yesterday. What are the effects of school inputs on child outcomes, right? On educational outcomes and what have you. Number of students per class and so on. When I wrote down that production function, I said, okay, the family is in this environment, and this environment is characterized by this vector S. And the family then, given those characteristics of the environment, chooses the inputs. In the United States, there's a lot of mobility. There's a lot of geographic mobility, much more so than Italia. They looked at the very interesting question of what if a household, through mobility decisions, was simultaneously choosing their inputs and the school inputs. This is don't worry, you didn't drink too much wine last night. This is out of focus. Totally out of focus. It's just meant to illustrate. In the United States, these are expenditures by state per pupil in the United States. In the Northeast up here, New York and all this, you see the black, those are the highest expenditures. That's my state where we pay a lot of tax. But taxes, schooling is mainly funded by state tax in the United States, right? Local tax, not federal tax. So you have a lot of heterogeneity. And also within states, you have a lot of heterogeneity in taxes for school and how much is spent on the students in the school. And there's been a number of studies done of this. When you buy a house, you buy a school district in the United States. It's very clear. If you look at houses for sale on the internet, the United States will say, in this school district. That has a big effect on the housing price. They made the point of what if these local states or even smaller areas, urban areas, they have different labor markets and they have different schools. What if households choose a geographic location through a migration decision? By doing that, they're choosing the school inputs, and they're able to choose the labor market that they live in as well. By doing this, you can choose, for example, you could say, I want to work. I'll go to an area where they spend a lot of money on schools. That'll substitute for my being away from the home more, okay? And they actually then estimated this very complicated model. I won't go into it. But they could then look at these effects and say, taking into account what we call the endogeneity, the people are making these decisions, that the school characteristics you face are not something predetermined or something you're choosing, basically. Taking that into account, they found that the effect of school characteristics on child outcomes was reduced tremendously. Didn't have much of an effect. They found that the effect of mothers working on child outcomes went from being negative to being positive. And basically, that was all these reversal of effects was due to the simultaneous choice of the school inputs, the public inputs, the environment, and the household inputs. So that's a very interesting study there where they specify, forms of preferences, lots of things you can take issue with, but they get these strong results that are very suggestive of things we should look at. Now I'll basically conclude plugging my own research. This is some work done with Myrta Brown. So this is a little bit fuori tema, but it's about the environment. In the United States, you have to look at mechanisms. As I say, many of the results we have that I've been referring to come from the United States. What's the main thing that impacts child outcomes in the United States? Household structure. In the United States, about 1/2 of marriages end in divorce. If you look at marriages with children, it would be less than that. Okay, maybe 1/3 of marriages with children would end in divorce, let's say. Children that come from divorced households or possibly unwed mothers, mothers that were never married, have significantly lower outcomes, controlling for lots of other factors, than children who don't. So we want to look at what the effect is. In this case, we're looking at the state. The state, the emphasis of this research is how the state, in this case, if you raise the participation rate in Italy, it may well be the case that the divorce rate will increase as well. Women will have more money, they'll have more opportunities, they'll have more chances to move, to change region, to take advantage of these opportunities. There'll be more stress in the household, there may be more divorces. So this is a thing specific to the United States, but it may be a concern in the future also in a country like Italy. We're saying in this case, marriage laws, divorce laws, have a strong effect on investment. That's our model. How divorce laws affect not only after after a couple gets divorced, how it affects expenditures on the child, but also how the state law that can either favor divorce or not can affect investment incentives in the child even while the couple are still married. Taking a step further back can even affect the decision of how many children to have. So I won't really go through this in any detail, except to say that we do find that divorce laws that are state-specific in the United States, right? They're not federal, they're state-specific. There's a lot of variation in the nature of the divorce laws in terms of how much the father has to pay the mother and all these things, child support payments, custody arrangements, and so on. These things do have a strong effect on investments in children and can explain, our measure is test score, verbal. State law variation can affect divorce rates, can affect investment incentives in children both after divorce and before divorce, and can affect, in fact, the decision to divorce. So I just want to make a strong claim that only by articulating more models like this that specify a mechanism that would relate things like the mother's employment to child outcomes. How does it work? What's the mechanism? What's the production technology? What are the constraints? Only by doing that, that's going to involve more theory, more data, more econometric work. But only by doing that can we advance our knowledge where we can really say something, where I can tell you that if the participation rate in Italy goes up of married women by 30%, this is what you may expect to see for the children. I can't do that now. All we have is some correlations, some associations. We have some studies that are trying to look at this in a more serious way with models. And it's such a complicated phenomenon, I would argue that's the only way you can understand a phenomenon like this. Thank you.
Beh, ringraziamo Christopher Flynn per questa relazione che ci ha dato.
Thank you very much for giving us a lot of food for thought. One of the last few slides you showed had that Brown and Flynn will make then lots of Italian women happy, because it seems that children of divorced families have a worse outcome. But before opening the Q&A to the floor, I've got a couple of very quick questions. We said that in Italy women work less than elsewhere for many reasons. For instance, as many observers and economists state, the lack of childcare services in Italy, especially for children younger than 3. A New York Times study just pointed out that children who go to childcare services when they are younger than 3 might have some focusing issues in the future. And they do not tend to go so much to childcare services in Italy. First of all, because there are not many, but also because Italian mothers do not think a lot about these childcare services. So does it mean that there is not such a direct relationship between a crash?
I didn't talk about social capital law or Jim Heckman's research program on these, but I'm just saying because it relates to that. We tend to concentrate on cognitive outcomes. How smart are you in terms of doing a test? How successful are you in the labor market, that we think is related to cognitive outcomes? Well, it's also, the claim is certainly among developmental psychologists, is strongly related to socialization. If you came from, let's say in the old days, let's say in Italy, if you had a family of 3, you're talking about a fair amount of interaction, at least among the figli, right? But now, if the family size is 1 or 2, staying at home, you're typically staying at home without other children around. There's a lack of possibility for socialization. So I think high-quality child care is definitely, at least a few hours a day, is definitely indicated for almost any child as absolutely increasing their quality in the long run, right through developing interactive skills with their children, hopefully other children of different backgrounds to some extent. These are all important things in life, both in terms of just being a citizen, but also in terms of labor market success or productivity. It's not just how smart you are in a test. It's how you work with other people and so on. These are developed only when you start socializing, and these skills are learned at early ages. There's a lot of evidence that if you take a kid and isolate that child till they're 4 years old and then put them in, it's too late. There has to be a strong socialization early on in life.
Un'altra domanda che anche insomma, mi incuriosisce molto. La natalità, abbiamo detto
Let me ask you another question. We said the Italian birth rate is quite low, but what's worse, we tend to have many families with single children. It is now a rule. Most of the women in my age range, between 30 and 40, tend to have an only child. But there is another interesting observation, because women interviewed, say, 18, 21 months after their first child, when the time has come for the second child, most of them say they would not bear the burden. Whereas if you interview them before they get married and have a child and ask them how many would you like to have, 61% say 2, 1/4 says 3 children, only 12% says 1 child only. So as it turns out, our aspiration for motherhood is great, but then it just clashes against the practical obstacles.
The paradox of Italy, basically, right? And this Mediterranean paradox is also true in Spain, also true in Greece. You have relatively low married participation rates, and yet you have low fertility rates as well. Usually the theory of the household fertility would say, okay, you make one choice or the other. Specialize in the labor market, specialize in producing children. Italy, you don't specialize in anything. So it's kind of a paradox. Why is that? I don't know. I don't have a good response. I have a child with my wife here. Went to Italian schools and so on. Costs of having children high in Italy. It could be before marriage. People don't really appreciate the cost or see the constraints. But having children that live at home until they're 30 years old, median age of leaving home 28 years old, something like that, certainly seems strange to an American. But this is related. I'm primarily a labor economist, and so I tend to think of a lot of these issues stemming from labor market inflexibility, housing market inflexibility, and so on. I think a lot of these issues, if you free up things, particularly the labor market, some of these things will tend to take care of themselves. People won't be young. People will be getting jobs earlier. They'll be able to support themselves, leave home earlier. That'll be less of a weight on the. Yeah,
Not too much in Italy.
Maybe, well, but it depends. You know, you have to really go to a freer labor market, and then vediamo. You know.
Vediamo.
These are extrapolations. Difficult to do extrapolations when something like that hasn't existed, at least for a long time. But certainly, one would think that a lot of these problems are related to other rigidities in the Italian environment that impact the family strongly. The mother being able to find work. You know, the mothers can't find part-time work. They would like to find part-time work. It's not available. Now some of the corporations are providing asilo nido, right? So at firms. These are also in the United States proven to be very popular and very successful. The firm, it doesn't cost the firm anything. The employees are willing to pay for it all themselves. And it has all the benefits for the firm, reducing turnover and so on. It's a compromise. If a firm wants full-time workers, you say, at least put my child there for part of the day. I can interact with the child. I can monitor the child. I can monitor what's happening to the child. This is a good compromise. So we need innovations like this. And one of the arguments is we need innovations to change the choice set of people. Another thing is telelavoro, you know, working at home, long-distance commuting, working on the phone, you know, working over the internet. Stay at home sometime with the child to the extent you can have tasks at work that allow you to do some work at home with your child. That's also something that can promote growth and fertility. But we need to change the set of options available to people.
E il problema culturale, Christopher, quanto pesa secondo te? Cioè l'Istat ci rivela un'altra
And what about the weight of the cultural problem based on Istat data? We know that fathers contribute very little to household work, also when mothers work outside their home. So when we ask working mothers whether they are helped by their husbands or not, 63% of them declare to be helped, not to be helped at all. And this, of course,
household
has an impact.
economist, as I am part-time, would argue that this is related to the labor market. Clearly, the way we view household bargaining, which I didn't talk about here, obviously, was that, you know, we come in, you have different preferences in your husband, and so on. I have different ones than my wife. How do we resolve these issues? Well, we bargain, at least implicitly. The theory of bargaining in economics says basically, well, who has bargaining power? You have this preferred outcome, I have this preferred outcome. Where's the compromise? Well, the compromise is related to your outside options. Outside options are in large part related to work you can find. So if, for example, the women don't have any labor market experience or whatever, husband says, you don't do what I want, vai via, you know. Woman has few options. You tend to think in a situation where the woman has experience, and this is documented to some extent using consumption data in households. If the woman's contributing more or has more of an income endowment than the man, the consumption for the same total household income, keep household income fixed, 50,000 euro a year. Give 30,000 to the woman in one household, 20,000 to the man in one, and switch that in another household. The consumption patterns are different. One reason could be because they have different levels of bargaining power. The one with 30,000 euro has more bargaining power. When the women start to enter the labor market more, they will have other sources of income, other options, other alternatives. Even if they don't exercise them, it's not that everybody's going to get divorced and run off. It's just to have that option, even if it's not exercised, that you bargain against. So right now, because the participation rates are so low and so on, this is one reason that theoretically why you would say there's women have relatively low power in the household.
Un'ultima domanda sul tema di quali politiche bisogna mettere in
Question
pratica
about the
per
policies which
incrementare
have
il
to
lavoro
be
femminile.
deployed in order
Ecco, due
to
economisti
improve
che conoscerai
female labor. Lesina and Kino, two economists whom you certainly know, proposed to levy fewer taxes on female labor, of course finding measures so that you can get those taxes as in another way. Are you convinced about the goodness of that or not?
No,
Visco's side.
I've talked to both of them about it. It's a thing that doesn't convince me. There's lots of reasons. Let me just put it the most basic reason.
Yeah.
The most basic reason is what I said before. There's a lot of problems with the Italian labor market. This is trying to go to a sort of second best solution. So there's all these problems. Forget about them. Let's not deal with them. Let's have different tax rates on husbands and wives. But certainly this is going to change the balance of bargaining power in the household. That's one thing, right? This has a huge welfare effect on single people in the population. Here's a poor guy who's unmarried, and now he just loses income, and he doesn't have a wife to offset that, right? So it's a kind of thing that I just don't think is that well thought out. You want to really free up the labor market, give everyone equal opportunity. There's nothing that says women should be in the labor market. They said, oh, one of their rationales for doing this is, well, this is going to increase the participation rate. We don't know whether increasing the participation rate is a good thing or not. We don't have the estimates. We don't know people's preferences. We can't say what the right level of participation should be in Italy. We have to do a lot more research to figure that out. Then if there tends to be a difference between what the right level would be and what the current level is, then we can talk about policies to change that. But certainly policies of differential taxation based on gender, that would be about the 300th policy down the list for me. There's lots of other more direct policies that make everything more open for everyone. That's what you want to do. You don't want to have more of a sexual warfare, right? You want to have policies that are clear, that promote, equal access to everybody.
Però c'è una cosa che sappiamo tutti, cioè che la discriminazione non è una buona cosa. I dati del Ministero del Lavoro di 10 giorni fa
issued by the Ministry for Labor 10 days ago state that mothers aged 30 to 40 years old make out 36% of cases of discrimination on the job, meaning that when they go on parental leave and then they go back to their job, but they are discriminated against due to the fact that they left their job for some time.
When they talk about their policy proposal, they talk about it as changing prices. It doesn't change prices. Only the market can set a price, unless you're going to have price controls, unless you're going to have the government set prices. That doesn't work too well. No. So they can set tax policy, but then the market is going to, so if there is discrimination, that's not going to solve the discrimination problem. All employers will do will adjust their wage offers to men and women. So in the end, your take-home pay can be the same as it is before. You know what I mean? Yeah. That doesn't change the offer. They can change the offer. There's these equilibrium effects that you have to consider. The employers, if they want to discriminate, they can undo this effect if they want to.
Ok, c'è qualcuno che vuol fare qualche altra domanda al professor Flynn?
Questions for Professor Flynn.
Abbiamo un microfono.
There should be a roving mic, which can be used for that purpose.
Ho visto che nel studio
seen that in your study you always made reference to children aged 3 or more, or older. And I was surprised by the fact that no reference was made to the working situation of women with children ages 0 to 3.
I just didn't point that out because I went through summer. So that's a real feature, is looking at what happens when, I just kept mentioning that because it got stuck in my mind, but most of the focus is on 0 to 1. Then there's a 1 to 2. If you have the whole history, you can look at every year and the impact of every year if you want. So there is that. So these effects are there. They're probably a little bit stronger for 0 to 1 than they are for 3. But they also tend to be, so some of these results I was showing actually refer to 0 to 1. You would think the most important age. So even there, negative effects of full-time employment of the mother tend to wear off over time. So there's not even a strong indication there. As I said before, I would always say that these are just associations. So almost anything can happen, but there's no strong association there, even for very young children.
Altre domande?
Any other question?
Ne possiamo prendere ancora altre due perché
We can take 2 additional questions and that's it.
Rapidissimo, io ho 3 figli.
I have 3 children.
Mia moglie è rimasta a casa dal lavoro.
With our first child, my wife remained at home for 2 or 3, for a couple of years. So she remained at home for 3 years with the first child, and then the second and third child, well, they attended nursery school, and my wife continued working. And I have not found an analysis about the results on children of working mothers related to the psychological condition of the mother who remains at home to take care of her child and suffers socially because she does not have any social life, because she does not work either. She feels isolated. Have you considered this?
So I should be clear. I don't really work on that problem per se. I don't really work on that particular problem. But these are very important. That's related to the point I was making when you say, what's the impact of the mother staying at home with the child instead of working, the other side? Depends on the conditions under which she's staying at home, right? If the mother's staying at home because they can't afford child care, it's not available. If the mother's depressed or whatever, that's going to have a very negative effect on the child. So it's important. These are all important mediating factors in determining these things. These are all important. Unfortunately, there's not one data set around that would study both the employment history of the mother, the psychological behavior, the stress of the mother, on the mother, whether she's depressed or not. There are psychologists who do studies of that. Unfortunately, they're not typically integrated with data that economists would use as measures of outcomes in the end about like unemployment or wages or what have you. But these are all extremely important factors. Then you have to ask, though, if the mother is depressed, how did that affect, and the child staying home, how did that affect the decision to have the child stay at home? I mean, it's complicated. But yeah, people certainly are aware of this. It's a question, a little bit of discipline boundaries. There's psychology, there's economics. They're both important, but there's no one data set, for example, that combines both these kinds of things. But they're extremely important.
Salve. Io avrei una domanda, nel senso
I also have a question. You talked about the need to have so you said that we need to have a free labor market, as if it were a panacea. But actually it is not easy to achieve that in Italy, because if you have a free labor market, a totally free labor market, then you have other problems. And of course you cannot change things completely. Instead of making a huge leap, you should simply advance by adjustments. I'm German. I live in Italy, so I know the Nordic situation, so to say, and also the southern one. And that is important, I believe, in order to understand fully a culture. So, leaving aside theory, I would say that what you said could be applied specifically to a specific culture.
Io credo che lui voglia dire che essendo il nostro mercato del lavoro molto complicato, fare dei cambiamenti...
Our labor market is very complicated. If you change one thing completely, then perhaps this is detrimental for something else. It is not politically possible, clearly. It is clearly so. You should tell Prodi. Yes. But Italian politics is very complicated.
Some hope. I mean, I think if you look at the case of Spain, Spain has made significant progress. Italy, some. Spain has made significant progress. You can always debate. Okay, these are fixed-term contracts, whatever. They're not like having a permanent job forever. Okay, but almost nobody, except me, because I have tenure, but almost nobody has a permanent job anymore. If everyone starts to understand that, it'll be more accepted. It'll be easier to actually implement labor market reforms than going from this transition period where you say, oh, this guy, he's got this job, he can never be fired no matter what he does. Well, these kinds of jobs are eventually, they're being eliminated. You don't read about it every day, but they are being eliminated in the public sector as well as in the private sector for sure. So it takes time. I'm not saying you can do this overnight, but it's going to happen. It's going to happen eventually. And when it does, you know.
Grazie a Christopher Flynn, grazie a tutti voi.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Christopher Flynn. Thank you all for being here, and see you again at 5:30.